The secure conference room on the 7th floor of the Department of Justice building had never hosted a more dangerous conversation. At 11:43 p.m. on a frigid January evening, Attorney General Pam Bondi sat across from FBI Director Kash Patel, a single classified folder between them containing information that could topple the entire Trump administration. The mahogany table reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting as Bondi opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were 847 pages of FBI surveillance reports, financial records, and witness testimonies that painted a picture so damaging, so explosive, that both officials knew their careers and possibly their freedom hung in the balance. Kash, Bondi began, her usually confident voice barely above a whisper, "We have a problem that makes every other scandal look like a parking ticket." Patel leaned forward, his years of intelligence work telling him this wasn't routine damage control. The FBI director had seen Bondi handle countless crises with ice-cold composure, but tonight she looked genuinely terrified. "How bad are we talking, Pam?" Bondi slid the first document across the table. It was a bank transfer record dated March 15, 2019, showing a $2.3 million payment from Little St. James LLC, Jeffrey Epstein's private island company, to a shell corporation called Enhanced Political Solutions. That shell company, Bondi said, her voice cracking slightly, was created by Trump's personal attorney 3 days before this transfer was made. Patel's face went pale as he studied the financial trail. His counterintelligence background had taught him to follow money, and this money led directly to the heart of the Trump operation. "There's more," Bondi continued, pulling out a second document. The FBI has phone records showing 17 calls between Epstein and Mar-a-Lago in the 2 weeks before his arrest. 17 calls, Kash, including a 43-minute conversation on July 4th, 2 days before federal agents took him into custody. The implications hit Patel like a freight train. If these records became public, they wouldn't just damage Trump politically. They could trigger a criminal investigation that would destroy everyone in the inner circle. "Who else knows about this?" Patel asked, his voice tight with concern. "Right now? Just us and the 3 FBI agents who compiled the report. But Kash," Bondi paused, gathering courage for what she was about to reveal. "Dan Goldman's office has been asking very specific questions about Epstein financial records, questions that suggest they know more than they should." Patel's blood ran cold. Goldman, the former federal prosecutor turned congressman, had the legal expertise and political motivation to turn this information into a nuclear weapon against the administration. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 48 hours before Goldman issues subpoenas that we won't be able to ignore," Bondi replied. "Unless," she let the word hang in the air between them. Both officials understood what "unless" meant in Washington. It meant making evidence disappear. It meant using their positions of power to obstruct justice. It meant crossing a line that neither had ever imagined crossing. "Pam, what you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Bondi interrupted. "I'm telling you that if these files see daylight, we all go down. Trump, you, me, everyone who's ever been in that inner circle." Patel stood up and walked to the secure window overlooking the Potomac River. The weight of the decision was crushing. He had built his career on exposing corruption, on holding powerful people accountable. Now he was being asked to become the very thing he had spent years fighting against. "There's something else," Bondi said quietly, "something that makes this even more complicated." She pulled out a final document, a surveillance photograph taken at Epstein's Manhattan mansion in February 2019. The image showed Trump entering the building through a private entrance, accompanied by 2 unidentified young women. "The FBI has been sitting on this for 2 years," Bondi explained, along with testimony from 3 witnesses who can identify those women and explain why they were there. Patel felt the room spinning. This wasn't just about financial connections or phone calls anymore. This was about potential criminal activity that could send a former president to prison. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Bondi's response would change both their lives forever. "I need those files transferred to the National Security Division under the highest classification level. I need the FBI agents who compiled the report reassigned to different offices. And I need your word that this conversation never happened." The request was clear. Use classification powers to bury evidence, intimidate witnesses through job transfers, and maintain a conspiracy of silence that would protect the most powerful man in America. Patel stared at the documents spread across the table. Financial records, phone logs, surveillance photos, witness statements, an evidence trail that would normally trigger the largest federal investigation in decades. Instead, they were discussing how to make it all disappear. "If we do this," Patel said slowly, "and it ever comes out, we're not just losing our jobs. We're looking at obstruction charges, conspiracy, abuse of power. If we don't do this," Bondi interrupted, "Trump gets indicted, the Republican Party implodes, and every enemy of this administration gets to pick through the wreckage for the next decade." The silence that followed was deafening. Both officials understood they were at a crossroads that would define not just their careers, but their moral legacy. Patel turned back from the window, his decision made. "What's the timeline?" "We need to move tonight," Bondi replied, relief flooding her voice. "The classification order needs to be signed before Goldman's staff arrives tomorrow morning. The agent transfers need to be processed as routine reassignments, and the original files need to be moved to a location where congressional subpoenas can't reach them." What neither official realized was that Special Agent Sarah Chen, one of the 3 agents who had compiled the Epstein report, was working late in the FBI building that very night, and she had been listening. Chen had been tracking unusual activity around the Epstein files for weeks. Late-night meetings, restricted access protocols, and whispered conversations between senior officials had triggered her counterintelligence instincts. When she saw Patel's security detail arrive at the Justice Department after midnight, she knew something significant was happening. Using her security clearance and knowledge of the building's surveillance systems, Chen had positioned herself in an adjacent conference room where she could monitor the conversation through the building's internal communications network. What she heard would change everything. As Bondi and Patel finalized their conspiracy, Chen was already copying the evidence files to a secure external drive. By dawn, she would have contacted 3 different journalists, 2 congressional offices, and the Department of Justice Inspector General. But for now, in that midnight conference room, Bondi and Patel believed they had successfully buried the most explosive evidence in American political history. "I'll have the classification order ready within the hour," Patel said, gathering the documents. "The transfers will be processed as routine personnel moves, and I'll personally ensure these files are relocated to a facility that's beyond congressional reach." Bondi nodded, her relief palpable. "We never had this conversation. These documents never existed, and if anyone asks, the FBI's Epstein investigation found no evidence of current criminal activity." As both officials prepared to leave, Patel had one final question. "Pam, what if this doesn't hold? What if someone talks?" Bondi's response revealed the depth of corruption they had just committed to. "Then we make sure they have bigger problems to worry about than talking to Congress." The threat was clear. Anyone who tried to expose their cover-up would face the full weight of federal law enforcement turned against them. What happened over the next 72 hours would determine whether American democracy could survive such a massive abuse of power. By 6 a.m., Agent Chen had transmitted copies of the Epstein files to secure servers maintained by 3 major news organizations. By 8 a.m., Dan Goldman's office had received an anonymous package containing financial records linking Trump directly to Epstein's operation. By noon, the Department of Justice Inspector General had opened an investigation into potential obstruction of justice by the Attorney General herself. But Bondi and Patel wouldn't learn about Chen's actions until it was too late to stop what they had set in motion. The first sign of trouble came at 2:47 p.m. when Bondi's chief of staff burst into her office with a look of panic. "Ma'am, Goldman's office just announced they're calling an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. They're saying they have new evidence about the Epstein files." Bondi's blood turned to ice. The timeline they thought they had didn't exist. Somehow their midnight conspiracy had already been exposed. Across town at FBI headquarters, Patel was receiving similar devastating news. 3 major newspapers were preparing stories about classified Epstein documents. Congressional subpoenas were being prepared. And most terrifying of all, Agent Chen had disappeared. The cover-up that was supposed to protect them had instead triggered the biggest government scandal since Watergate. As evening approached, both officials realized their midnight meeting hadn't saved their careers. It had destroyed them. The evidence they thought they had buried was already being examined by journalists, investigators, and prosecutors. In less than 24 hours, they had gone from being the most powerful law enforcement officials in America to being the targets of the largest obstruction of justice investigation in decades. The final irony was that their attempt to hide the Epstein evidence had created far more damaging headlines than simply releasing it would have. Instead of managing a controlled disclosure, they now faced criminal charges for conspiracy, obstruction, and abuse of power. That midnight meeting in the Justice Department's 7th floor conference room would go down in history as the moment when 2 of America's top law enforcement officials chose to become criminals rather than allow justice to take its course. And Agent Sarah Chen, the whistleblower who had brought down an attorney general and an FBI director, would be remembered as the person who proved that even the most powerful government officials are not above the law. The Epstein files were released in full 3 weeks later, revealing a network of corruption and protection that reached into the highest levels of American government. But by then, both Bondi and Patel were facing federal indictments that would ensure they never held public office again. Sometimes the cover-up really is worse than the crime, and sometimes justice prevails even when those sworn to uphold it try to destroy it. In the end, their midnight conspiracy had accomplished the opposite of what they intended. Instead of protecting Trump and themselves, they had ensured that every detail of the Epstein scandal would be exposed to the world. The truth, as it always does, had found a way.